Alrighty, so my backup is fine, but I've been talking to a guy named Greg from Australia in the comments of a previous video where I rebuilt that valve block there. He's having transmission problems, so I've been talking to him in the comments trying to kind of troubleshoot and diagnose what's going on with his machine. I thought it'd be easier to just make a quick video and go through my troubleshooting process. So I'm an industrial mechanic. I have quite a bit of experience troubleshooting problems with equipment that I generally understand but don't specifically understand. By which I mean I have not looked at a book or anything on this specific transmission. I don't know exactly what's going on in there, but I generally understand how it works. And that being the case, I have kind of a protocol that I go through personally that's tried and true. It generally works, and let me just walk you through that, let you into my head, and maybe that'll help or give you some ideas, and hopefully you can get your machine fixed. Alright, so like I said, I haven't looked at any books or anything on this. I've not personally been inside that transmission, so I don't know exactly what's going on in there, but that's actually good. Before I get into a book or anything, I like to look at the piece of equipment and mentally work my way through it all. And what I'm trying to do is just come up with as many possible theories of what is wrong as I can. And once I have as many theories as I can think of, and take a lot of notes, take pictures, collect any data that you can, pressures, anything like that, then I go to the books. So first step is just looking at what we got and trying to decide where the potential problem is. Now, this is a hydraulic system, right? So there's kind of three things that we need to think about. One, there's a pump in there somewhere, and I would guess that it's a direct or a positive displacement pump, and I would guess that it's directly driven off the crankshaft. And I would guess because of that, it's probably a gear pump. You've already got rotation. Gear pump just makes sense in my head. Alright, so we have the device that makes pressure, and being a positive displacement pump, again, I'm assuming here, but it's going to have a pressure regulating valve, which this does, and it's right here. It's inside of this gallery, and that's controlled by a spring and kind of a check ball that's adjusted with some shims on the backside of the spring. Okay, so we have pressure generation and regulation. That's the first thing. The second thing to think about, which is different, is flow. Okay, so even if the pump is working correctly, and even if the pressure relief valve or regulating valve, which they can be the same or they can be two separate things, in this case I think they're the same, but just because they're working correctly doesn't mean that you're putting the flow to the correct place. Does that make sense? And so it could be flowing back to tank inadvertently if there's something wrong with the valves themselves, or if there's some other problem that's just causing the pressure that the pump's making just to flow back to the tank, right? That's problem number two. So we have pressure, generation, regulation, and then we have flow control, basically, which is what this valve block is supposed to do. And then, so the third thing that you need to think about is related to the flow, but it's leakage. And just because you're not seeing leak on the outside of the machine, right? Like there's not just oil pouring out on the ground anywhere, but you can have leakage on the inside. So the flow control and the leakage, they're kind of the same thing. But the way I think about them anyway is a little bit different. And so an example of internal leakage, for instance, right? There's not a lot of oil coming out just pouring out of the machine. I mean, you can see it's dry underneath of it. But this particular cylinder, I've not rebuilt it yet, but the piston in here, the seal on the piston, somewhere down in here, is leaking. And so whenever I pressurize the cylinder up here, in order to hold this in the lock position, the pressure leaks past the pump, or leaks past the piston rather, and it ultimately trends towards zero. And so this whole thing will get floppy, and eventually it'll actually fall off the catch because it's kind of messed up. But what's going on is we have fluid that's leaking from this side of the piston or the cylinder to this side of the cylinder inside of there. So you can't see it, but you have leakage. Okay, so internal leakage. So let's kind of go through this and think about your potential theories of what's wrong. So we know that there's a pump in here. Like I said, that's probably a positive displacement pump, probably a gear pump, and then we have a regulator up here. So this backhoe, or your backhoe, has sat for 20 years, and a known problem with these is that they get water in the transmission oil, right? Which it's just universal tractor fluid. It is what we call miscible with water, which means that they mix pretty readily. The water will emulsify with the oil. Even though it's still full of oil, that will cause corrosion inside of there. And so you could have corrosion on the gears themselves of the pump, and so your pump may not be making enough pressure. The other problem that you can have with your pressure generation and regulation is that the regulator itself is just a spring with a check ball on the end that's controlled by some shims. And so there could be pack rust built up in here that's causing that to be out of tolerance. The spring could be broke, and so it's always just dumping to, that would actually be the more likely scenario, that it's always just dumping fluid back to the tank. And there could be corrosion in the galleries causing that to not work correctly. And so you can have corrosion problems inside of this block. The way to disprove that theory would be to take this block off and inspect it. Look at all the spools in there, look at the regulator valve, everything. Just go through that and make sure that everything's cool in there. Before you do that, though, there's another potential problem on your pressure generation side, right? Which is related to lack of flow. The second potential problem. That lack of flow can be a upstream problem or a downstream problem, meaning that it can be a gallery in here that's clogged, but it could also be the pickup line that's clogged. Now, mine has these valves that come off of here, and I don't think they're all equipped with this, but those end up coming over here. This is a filter, and then these lines run through a radiator, or the radiator, and so it's got a transmission cooler on it. That filter is the same as the hydraulic filter. I'll put a thing here, tells you what that number is. I've got it handy back at the house. So I don't think that is part of the actual pressurized loop though on the system. I think this is a separate cooling loop, and so that's probably not your problem. If you've got one of these though, if it's been sitting for 20 years, replace it. All right, so the pickup for this hydraulics, it has a strainer on it, right? The pickup for the pump, and it, I call it a hydraulic pump. That's essentially what it is, and that can be clogged up with something. A lot of people, they don't make gaskets like I did on this one. They just put like Permatex or something in there, and I've seen similar situations where the Permatex kind of squeezes out on the inside, gets dragged into the system and trained, and ultimately it can clog up the strainer. Bad news is, if that's the case, you pretty much have to split the tractor. As far as I'm aware, you have to have the transmission out. If we look underneath here, your pickup line sits in here somewhere. Probably further back. So you may be able to get like a borescope or a mirror or something where you could look at it from inside of there, but there's no access. There's no convenient access from the bottom anywhere. And I think the only way to get in there is to you remove this valve block, and then underneath of that is a plate, and you can see the bolts for it right over there. That plate, unfortunately, you can also see them over here, and I think that's all one plate. It may split right there, and if that's the case, you may be able to get that top plate off with, everything still attached, but you would have to remove the fuel tank, but yeah, so that would be kind of worst case scenario. Look at that again. So it's wrong. Your pickup line's not going to be up here. It's going to be down here because that's the lowest point, right? So it's going to be in this kind of gallery somewhere. that's what a pickup line's going to be. That's going to be hard to get to. So, I mean, that's, I wish I had better news for you on that. Okay, so that's a one potential flow problem. The other one is an internal leak on one of these two spools. And so, not really sure about adjustment on this guy. There's not like a good way to adjust it. There's not a convenient way. But on your clutch pedal here, we have this, and this is what I referred to before. This is an eccentric, and you specifically ask, how do you turn this? Or yes, if it's free spinning, you know, how does it work? And the answer is it's normally not. All right, so if yours is, then this is likely a potential problem. What's going on is back in here, way back here behind, there's a nut inside of here on the back side of this. And so if you loosen that nut off back here, then you can turn this, and this is kind of your fine adjust on your clutch pedal here. You also have a coarse adjust right here. And so to fix that, or to change that, you would take that pin out, or the cotter pin, and then the actual pin, and you can turn this and adjust your clutch in and out as to where it actuates. And then this is, like I said, eccentric, and so you can turn this and adjust that. And that will change the position of the valve, and if it's just out of timing, if it's not in the right spot, I should say, then you can potentially fix that internal leakage from just changing this, right? So if that internal leakage is caused by this valve or this spool not being in the correct place, then you can change where this is finally with this. So that's an option. All right, so back up here. As I'm thinking this through, and this is the first thing that I asked you about was that eccentric, because that's the easiest thing to change. If that's just in the wrong spot and the valve is not correctly seated so that it's providing positive pressure, then that would explain the lag in your clutch pedal. That would explain the clutch not working once the tractor's running. And so that's why I thought about that first, because that's the easiest piece of the system to change. You can do it all from the outside without taking anything apart. Just turn that, you know, maybe 90 degrees, and then see if that changes anything. Turn it another 90 degrees, see if that changes anything. You can test it that way. If that doesn't work, the next easiest thing, actually, let me back up. First easiest thing, change the filter. See if that helps. Like I said, I'll put that up on the video here, that part number. Same as the hydraulic filter. If that doesn't work, the next easiest thing would be to remove this valve block. And it's kind of a pain, but it's not that bad. Look at all the galleries in there, inspect where your spools ride, inspect the spools themselves, and all the seals on that. If they're not sealing correctly, if there's some sort of a bad seal in there that's causing internal leakage, then you won't be able to build pressure. And the way I think about these and the way I think this works, if I remember right, which honestly, when I took this apart, I was just investigating the leak, and so I didn't really pay much attention to how the galleries were set up. I did note that it was beautifully machined, but I wasn't really looking at how that worked. But I think that these two spools, right, they essentially operate in series, meaning that if one of them is open or slightly open, then the whole system is negated. So the way I think this is intended to work, and the way I would think about this as a designer, is that this is kind of your driver back here, this spool, and that's your lever, right, up there on the steering wheel, on the steering column rather. That's your driver, so that's your forward, neutral, reverse, and then this is kind of your clutch pedal itself. I would think of it kind of as an emergency shutoff, and you can use it however you like as an operator. You can use that to put it in neutral all you want, but it's only necessary, or it's not actually necessary to shift gears or to do anything, because if that lever is in neutral, then there's no pressure, which will cause the clutch to engage, right? So if either one of these is in neutral, and that's the important part, then the tractor's going to stay in neutral. But if for some reason either of these is causing pressure to get ported to prevent the tractor from going into neutral, which seems like kind of a weird scenario to me, but if that was the case, then you would never be able to put it in neutral. And so perhaps if this valve is sticking, right, the one that's over the steering column, if it's sticking somewhere that it's forcing fluid to go to engage the clutch, right, to engage the engine to the transmission, then you would never be able to get it completely in neutral. Maybe you could get it partially in neutral, and maybe you would have enough of a clutch that you could prevent the engine from being able to move the entire inertia of the tractor sitting still. And then once you let off, it builds pressure and you take off. But you could have a problem with either one of those valves, and again, regulating valve in here. So you can check all of that at once inside of this valve block. If you get to that point and you still haven't found the problem, then the next possible option is that you don't have pressure because there's a downstream blockage, right? Which is that strainer that I was talking about. And for that, as far as I'm aware, you either have to take the transmission off of the engine, or you have to take the top of the tractor off out of your way. So that means your hood here, your gas tank, which is right in there, the steering column, all of that. You got to get all of that out of your way so that you can take the top plate off the transmission and then get down in there to find that suction line. So, yeah, I hope that's not the case. Hopefully it's in this valve block. That's not so bad. And it could just be a bad seal on either of those spools causing your problem. It could be a bad spring, and it could just be bad adjustment of your eccentric or of your clutch in general. And so if that doesn't work, you might try adjusting your course adjust here. So I don't know what all you've done at this point, but that's the way that I troubleshoot and think through it. Hopefully that all makes sense. But the first thing that I always do is just generally go through the machine and develop theories on what I think's wrong with it. And if you can find a good book on it, then that would be the next step. And then just try to disprove those theories and see what you can come up with. Alrighty, so I'm a mechanical engineer, and as such, I'm kind of scatterbrained the way that I think about this sort of problem. Or maybe I'm a mechanical engineer because I'm scatterbrained, I don't know. But that's hopefully helpful. So that's kind of my thought process for going through this type of problem. And I'm kind of have trouble kind of codifying that in a way that I can like explain it to you, because it all kind of happens all at once in my head, and I don't have a good way to explain it. But all those different problems, those different failure points are all possibilities, and you just have to figure out which one's more likely and figure out ways to disprove each theory until you get to the point that you're taking it apart and looking at the inside to figure out what's going on. And hopefully you can eliminate enough theories that the first thing you take apart is the correct thing, and then you can just fix it right off the hop. So just to kind of walk back through the steps, the first thing you need to do is just identify what kind of system you're generally working with, and then kind of try to decode all the potential failure points. So you got pumps, regulators, blockages, right, a clog in the system, something like that, potentially bad filter, potentially bad strainer, whatever. So you have flow that has to go into the pump, you have flow that has to come out of the pump. That flow has to make it to the correct spot. You have to be building the correct amount of pressure. There's a lot of seals involved, and actually in this case, not a whole lot. It's relatively simple, so that's good. Anyway, hopefully this helps you, Greg, and anybody else that's having a similar problem with just the process of troubleshooting it. I wish I had a more finite answer for you, but I just don't, because I haven't actually had the transmission apart on mine. So maybe someday it'll break down, and then I'll have to take it apart, and of course I'll film it if that ever happens, but hopefully it doesn't. But if it does, bonus content. So anyway, hope that helps somebody. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.